Yeah, my name is Robert Humble. I'm the principal of hybrid architecture. I guess I grew up in San Antonio, Texas, and went to architecture school at Texas Tech University. And growing up in San Antonio and growing up in it was pretty suburban, and there wasn't a lot of urbanity. When I was a kid, and then where I went to school. But after I graduated from college, I I sold all my stuff and I traveled around Europe for several months and really kind of saw the way, European cities functioned, the way urbanity functioned, the way, architecture really related to context, and was very inspired by that, architecturally, but also just from an urban planning standpoint. And while I was there, I met a number of people from the Seattle area. This was also in 1993, so Pearl Jam and Nirvana and grunge was all the thing, and every hostel or every bar that you stepped into was playing music from Seattle. So it's kind of a real cultural center globally, then at least for the music industry. So, when I was finished with my travels, I had to start a career somewhere. I had never been to Seattle, but I packed up my stuff and moved here sight unseen, and moved into a share house with 11 roommates I'd never met, just 3 blocks down the street from where I'm sitting right now. And that's the kind of that's how the initial formation, at least my background, and how I started as an architect. I guess at the time there was a recession, and I didn't have really any solid connections in the industry here, so it was very difficult to get my first job. And eventually I landed I think a 2-week contract for NBBJ, a large international firm here, and stretched that from 2 weeks to 2 months to eventually about a year. And then at that point I realized that I certainly respected the work they were doing. It was very impressive. It was a great place to start, but I didn't think personally I wanted to make a career out of doing these, very, very, very large buildings. And I also saw people that were at MBBJ that were young, that had maybe been there 5 years, and in that 5 years, they really had only worked on one project. That was the time frame for this. There was a big hospital that I was involved in at the very tail end of it, and there were some other people there that were 30 or so, and in the 5 or 6 years of their career, that was the only project they'd ever worked on. In a big hospital in Alaska somewhere. The hospital is 1,000 miles away. You'd never see it. It's just that I wanted things to move faster. So I left that firm and went to a smaller firm and did my internship. And I always had a vision that I wanted to start my own firm. So I got licensed just as quickly as I could out here. Started my first firm called Robert Humble Architects, and as a lot of young professionals or young firm owners, you kind of have to kind of take the projects that come to you. And after 3 or 4 years of my own firm, I wasn't particularly proud of the work we were doing. It was starting to at least make a living at it, but the work wasn't particularly inspiring. So along this same time, a friend and I started to enter some competitions, and we formed a competition team called Hybrid. And when we formed this team, we asked ourselves, we could have built the team out of a bunch of architects, but it would have been a very homogenized kind of way of thinking about the world. So we asked ourselves, what are some values that are important to Seattleites, or values that are important to us? And then we went and recruited people to this team who were kind of thought leaders in these respective fields. So we had landscape architects, we had urban ecologists, we had city historians, we had some fine artists. And I think that gave us a real big, broad scope of the way we would kind of address these competition entries. And, over time it began to generate some steam. And all along this time, I was still basically, me and Joel, who was my partner, we're working for Robert Humble Architects. So we were kind of getting paid through the work of Robert Humble Architects, well, we spent probably the first 3 or 4 years, without any paying commissions through hybrid. But eventually that led to a small job, and that led to another job and another job. And there's just a kind of a couple of clients that really kind of gave us a springboard to some sustainable projects that we could sustain a lease of business with. And then I closed Robert Humble Architects and focused solely on hybrid. But I think the real difference of that was that, where Robert Humble Architects is really kind of focused on really just kind of, I wanted to be my own boss. I wanted to, control my own destiny as an architect. But with hybrid, it's really kind of formed on a foundation of values that were important to us, and a certain philosophy that we were able to not have to worry about paying clients and budgets and timeframes. We would create the architecture we wanted to create through these competitions. And eventually that attracted clients who also, whose values reflected our own. And that kind of laid a really firm foundation basically for hybrid at the time. And that was, close to 20 years ago.
20 years. So that's like, how long did it take you to like really be really satisfied with the way things are going from the start? Like you mentioned, yeah, the first 3 to 4 years you were still like struggling. And how I'm just curious, how long did it take you to like really have that momentum?
I mean, 15 years. It's
That's a long time.
well, it's like, the first 4 or 5 years we're struggling to just make a living at it. And
Yeah.
all of it was really interesting. We were being published internationally.
Mm,
We had a huge following, digitally. So
mm,
we were getting a lot of press and a lot of notoriety for the work we were doing.
mhm.
But financially, it wasn't on firm footing. And then eventually, we started to, have real clients, real paying work.
Yes.
And then it's a different thing. Then you're having to manage the projects and manage the budgets and manage your clients and manage your time. And, that took another 5 years to really get systems in place
Mm,
as an architectural business, um, that it was on a stable footing. And then, of course, all through this time, we've gone through multiple, you know, situations of, when we started the firm, there was an earthquake, and then, of course, right soon after that, the tech economy crashed. And then, of course, we had 9/11, and then we've had, various political uprisings here over the last few years, and the Great Recession, and now we're in another kind of a down period. So, in times where maybe we were on steady footing with our work and our business, the economy wasn't helping us, and that would slow you down for 3 or 4 years. I mean, the Great Recession was like, I remember, what it must have been like 2007 or so. People were saying, don't, you just got to wait it out. It will just be 3 or 4 years. And it was a 3 or 4 year slog before this country really came out of that. And then from 2011 to very recently, it's been like an 11-year just boom. So the last 10 years has been foundational to really the success, I think, of the work we're doing.
So we're curious about your firm, because I think it's in a way multifaceted, because your firm is also a developer and you also do design build. Could you tell us how you got interested into delving into this type of approach in your architecture?
Um, well, I think, when I was a kid, I was always pretty entrepreneurial, and, just as soon as I could, maybe I'd be out on the street selling lemonade, or growing up in Texas, we'd be mowing lawns, long before I could drive. I was pushing my lawnmower down the block
Yeah.
and making money, mowing lawns. And then I would use that
Yeah.
money and buy bicycles and all these things that kids, couldn't afford and wouldn't have to ask my parents for it. I could buy it myself. So So I was always somewhat entrepreneurial. And actually, when I was growing up, my next door neighbor, he was an architect and a developer. And he was actually he had immigrated from Mexico and crossed the border when he was 4 or 5 years old, didn't speak any English, and made himself into a very successful architect and developer. So it's obvious that he could it just gave me confidence, I guess, that if he could do this crossing the border, illegally when he was a child and become a successful architect and developer, that certainly I could. So that was kind of always in the back of my mind.
Yeah.
And really about the same time we started hybrid architecture practice, about, well, like I say, about 20 years ago is when I bought my first lot with a friend of mine and developed our first project, which is a project called Remington Court that we're still very, very proud of. But I think I was really interested, a lot of times as an architect, the first line that is drawn is not yours. It's drawn by the developer. The developer is the one that's going to define, the real vision for the lot and the biggest picture. Like a lot of developers come to you, I've got a vacant lot and I want to do 4 units, I want to do 60 units, I want to do 160 units. And it's going to have this and it's going to have that and it's going to be whatever. And it's your job to kind of respond to that. I think if you're your own developer, you can say, well, maybe 4 units is too much. What if we did 3? Or what if we, pull some scale off the table? Or what are some other values that we can bring in? A lot of what we do now is flexible and adaptable units and housing types that can kind of change over time very easily. And that's a way that we can address affordability, address density, living in the city. And these are concepts that another developer is not necessarily going to bring to you. They're not going to come to you and ask you for a flexible, adaptable home. They might, but there's not that many of them. But if you can demonstrate it yourself and you can do it yourself and get it built and it succeeds in the marketplace, now people will come to you. So we kind of always use this to kind of introduce new ideas to the marketplace, and some are more successful than the others, but it's been very rewarding, kind of architecturally and artistically. It's also been rewarding financially. Typically we take the profits from one project and go buy land and do the next project. And if you do that over a period of years, you can do larger and larger projects and have bigger and bigger impact.
Plus, you also have that full control in terms of the design aspect, because you also control the basically the land, right?
Well, and there's obviously there's a lot of things that go into the creation of the building,
Mhm.
and a lot of it is financial, and there's opportunities, but also some real restrictions of what you can do financially for these projects. And then that has to boil down to can you afford to build it? We have to so having our own construction company, I think we have to be very diligent and reductive. Frankly, that also drives a lot of our work. It is not usually in MLS, it's not terribly complicated. I think by simplifying things, it makes it much more buildable, because generally we're creating things on the open or speculative market that that has to perform. Like if we lose money on all of our development projects, we're not going to be developing very well.
Yes, plus I think you have this unique insight in terms of approaching your architecture, because you know the market, you know the economy. So I think it all also brings this unique take on architecture.
There's one project that we recently completed here in Soldi, Mexico. We could talk about that one. That was very unique. This is some of the the larger ones that we're kind of doing. These projects probably represent kind of the scale of the projects that we do for other developer clients where these ones here really represent the kind of the scale of the projects that we design and develop ourselves that we also build. So maybe we could start with the oak and the alder.
Yes.
I think this is one of the ones that was in Art Daily recently, and this was a project that was, really kind of once again all about context. This was on a kind of very prominent kind of corner lot on a very heavily trafficked street. I can't really see if there's a good photo of it, but there's it's kind of across the street to the left here. There's a big historic brick high school that is kind of has this red brick, and then you can see to the right is one of these historic, craftsman homes. And a lot of our development projects initiate through relationships with people in the community. I mean, the great majority of them do. So I had known for a long time, actually, the person that owned this home, and they just said this is kind of like their side yard. There wasn't anything built on the corner here. So we worked with my friend to subdivide his lot into two lots, and that took about a year or so. And then we bought, the parcel from him. So we didn't have any displacement. We didn't have any demolition, when we started with the land. And I think that it was just a pure play on just kind of adding a little bit of density. There's only 2 units, so there's not incredible amount of density, but that's okay. There's 2 units where 2 units previously did not exist. But I think contextually, really what we wanted to do was kind of relate to the scale and the streetscape. So we kind of had this 410 siding that is patinaed to this really nice rusty color that reflects the brick across the street, and also kind of holds its own on the corner. It's a big school, and it takes an entire block. So I think we wanted to kind of have a building form that was simple, had some bulk and mass to it, so it kind of hold its own against the scale of the project across the street, while relating to some of the built context of what people would consider a house. So if you kind of look at the little building to the right, the little house, what are some of the elements it has? It has a recessed front stoop. It has some concrete steps that take it down to the sidewalk. And we repeated those elements on our own project. Of course, it has some punched openings. It's got this dormer on the roof that implies occupation of that space. And we've done that with the kind of the skylight. So we've kind of reinterpreted a lot of the formal elements of what a house is, in a very modern way, and kind of, starting from the fact of like, if a kid was to 6-year-old was to draw a house, it probably wouldn't look exactly like this house on the right. It's got kind of too many elements and bay windows and things going on. They wouldn't think of it that way. They would reduce it all the way down closer to kind of what we had. And then as we turn the corner, we kind of have our roof pitch here that reflects the pitch of the roofs of the context on that street. And as we kind of turn to the other unit, the roof pitch changes 90 degrees and reflects the direction of the roof pitched on that side. So that's just kind of another kind of way of acknowledging on a corner lot, the context. So another thing that was, interesting about this house that we could get into is we kind of have this idea of flex spaces where it's maybe a little small to read, that this lower floor essentially of this unit is what we call a flex space. It has 3 levels in total, and this lofted kind of top floor. So this lower unit here, you enter at the landing, and you really enter kind of at this level. And this is actually, there's 2 bedrooms on this level, and then you go up to the top floor where there's the living room, and then kind of the living room has this kind of big lofted volume where there's this kind of little mezzanine here, which just adds that additional little space. It's not enclosed, it's not a bedroom, but it's very valuable to people in a compact living situation, and people, they use it for their home office. If they're doing a Zoom call, this would probably be where you'd be doing it. A lot of people are working from home. How does, a home is no longer kind of where just people, go at night to sleep and watch TV. A lot of times people are spending their entire days in the house, and that's obviously a really recent phenomenon. So how can these, new units kind of address that? And we think that kind of these programmatically indeterminate spaces that we call it can allow for one person, actually the person that lives here, they have their home office and a music studio up here. The other people, they are using their little lofted flex space. They've got a little den for their kids and a television room and Xbox and everything. So all that messy kid stuff can happen kind of up there, and they don't have to live with it in their living room every day. But more importantly, kind of it's the ground floor that we really call the flex space. And typically this unit has its own kind of door at grade on the side. You can see here, it's actually very subtle because it's just kind of a second entry. You can barely even see it. It's just kind of hidden back there. So the primary entry to this unit is off to the side here, down to the sidewalk. This is a secondary door that maybe you can see better here. I don't know. That basically allows for, there's at the bottom of the stair, there's a door that can be locked from the inside and can either provide access from the primary residence into that lower level. They can use it as an additional bedroom, or that door can be locked, and then the people that are living on the primary level can rent that space as an apartment. They can rent it as an Airbnb. It is this kind of flex space that this allows an individual, a single guy that bought this unit, and it was expensive. It was over $1 million, but he rents the ground floor to a good friend of his, and he probably pays a couple $1,000s a month in rent, and that helps kind of cover his mortgage. And we do a lot of that, basically, where we try to kind of create these flex spaces that can change and adapt over time. It could be in the future that the guy that lives upstairs gets married and has some kids, and he wants the entire house for himself, and he can very easily do that. And we've seen over the years how people have used this flex space where maybe 10 years ago they would be renting it as an apartment, and then technology changed and Airbnb came around, and people started renting these as Airbnbs, in which case they can pay almost the entirety of their mortgage through Airbnb income. Of course, the pandemic came and the whole Airbnb thing was kaput, and people started to use those spaces as their home offices. And we even had one owner who, their kids and some neighbor kids would come over every day, and they hired a tutor, and they used their flex space as a little learning pod during the pandemic when schools were closed. And then, the pandemic ceases to exist and kids go back to school, and then they transition this flex space to somewhere else. So, part of what I like about this house is just, once again, kind of formally, it's very simple, very reductive. It's, relating to its context and some of its formal elements. Obviously, in scale, it's taller than the neighboring building.
Yes.
But probably what I'm more proud of is the fact that it can do things that another similar house cannot do, and that can allow it to adapt and evolve kind of over time.
Robert, can you explain more about this rusted facade? Because there is a time element to it, and how did you pick this material for the facade?
Yeah, well, this is Corten steel, and it is intended to rust, and it's kind of like the bark of a tree. Like, basically, the Corten will rust the steel, and eventually it develops this patina that will prohibit it from rusting further. So it's a very kind of natural material, and it will not, it will never need to be painted. And this photo was probably taken, I don't know, 8 months or so ago, and right now it's a very even red color. Yeah. When we first did it and when we first put it up, it was steel. I mean, it looked like unfinished raw steel, and then it started to rust, and a friend of mine was like, "Man, the building of yours is really rusting." I'm like, "I know, it's fine. It's supposed to."
I'm curious to know the neighbors' experience, Robert.
The neighbors?
Yeah. Anyone complained about the rusty look in the neighborhood?
Because neighbors
this is
tend
so
to be
bold.
like Yeah, neighbors tend to be like nosy about this type of unique approach
Yeah.
in our design.
When you're using
I
this
think
type of new materials, they are not like curious.
I think they liked it. You know, I think I haven't heard any negative comments. I'm sure there are negative comments. You know, one of the I forget. Yeah, one time we were standing out in front, and the kids across the high school were getting out of school, and you know, we just heard them chatting as they were walking down the street, and one of them's like, I forget exactly what he said, something like, "Man, that project is dope. That's the bomb." So, you know, anytime like you get a 15-year-old that's kind of like giving you fist pump, like, yeah, we're doing something right. So, you know, once again, I think certainly its materiality is aggressive, you could say. But now that it's, you know, but it relates very directly to the color of the building across the street, and I think architecturally, it somehow it makes a connection. And it's once again on a very kind of a prominent, heavily trafficked street, and we get every week I get contact by a potential new client who has seen this project and somehow went and found it and found that we designed it and then contact us. So it's like, you know, and this is not we've used this material on a couple other projects, just one other. You know, we use it on, I don't know if this is one on Art Daily. This is one that we developed a few years ago called the Steel Stack. And there was kind of there was this existing little cafe in front that we demolished. No, excuse me, we kept the existing cafe, but there was all these terrible, crazy additions to the back of it. So there's a big sprawling kind of spaces back behind here that we took down, kept the cafe, and then built these kind of 4 units behind it. But this is also, you know, Corten steel, and this also kind of, you know, this is its flex space. So this is on the ground floor, and maybe you can see in plan that you know, it's kind of designed in a way where there's kind of 2 doors up here in this little recess entry, and you know, primary occupant can kind of enter here and go up the stairs. This is this little door here that can just kind of be locked, and then this could be rented as its own little apartment in Airbnb with its own entry. So this is also one of the units that was kind of used as a learning pod. And in this case, we had kind of a 4-story height limit. So, you know, lots of times we're trying to do something kind of fun and funky up top. So we kind of did this, you know, this is this kind of roof garden that we created up here. So we had some privacy for these units. We kind of did this real funky space with astroturf, and it's got these really tall walls that kind of open to the sky. And, you know, certainly that's something that I haven't seen in other projects. This is actually the first project that I said we did almost 15, 20 years ago. Still very proud of it. And then this was another project that we developed maybe 3 years ago. This was once again kind of, you know, look at the context of some of the existing, you know, the neighboring buildings side by side and their pitched roofs. You know, the 2 doors down here is kind of more indicative of what the development would be in this area. It's kind of flat roof, doesn't really pay a whole lot of context, but it's got, you know, 1, 2, 3 units. And similarly, you know, we created 3 units, but tried to tie it into the context. And, you know, these units, a couple doors down, they have a roof deck that's pretty highly valued here because you don't have a whole lot of open space at grade. So people kind of get up on the roof and use it as a yard, but lots of times they're very exposed. They could be it's a very rainy area. It's actually very hot here in the summer, very windy. You don't have any privacy. So we, in this case, kind of carved out this little space within the roof for a smaller roof deck that we feel is kind of more appropriately scaled, does provide privacy, you know, still kind of maintains that funky streetscape that we're looking for. And, you know, this is once again where like in materiality, it's like, you know, we'll just leave the framing exposed. I mean, this is free. You know, it's like, how can we kind of create some little architecture very, very efficiently and affordably? And, you know, I think these buildings are no more beautiful architecturally when they're framed up. And then at least in this country, you go and you start covering them all up with all this interior materials. And we think it's really great that, you know, in a lot of cases, we'll leave these materials exposed. And gives it a sense of architecture presence. It really doesn't cost any money. And also we think it reflects, our local culture. Up here in Seattle, it's very heavily forested. All the lumber that is used in, really the West Coast comes from this general area. We're kind of we historically were a logging and fishing community. So we feel like expressing that materiality in the structure is often important. There's lots of cabins. People grow up with, the grandparents have a cabin on the woods. It's all exposed wood. So we think kind of, once again, somehow intellectually people relate to that. That's kind of on a core level how they experience architecture.